All right, we're going to try this again. So I've been doing these shows for 7 years now, and Dan and Ash are both laughing at me because Tina was about 3 minutes into her presentation before I realized I forgot to hit the go live button. So we're going to try this again. Tina Berry, CEO of Simply Sweet Games, level up your leadership. All right, start again from the beginning, Tina.
Thanks so much, Jay. I'm joining you all from British Columbia, Canada, and I want to thank the Indie Game Business team for inviting me to join. In today's presentation, I plan to share insights on how you can level up and become a truly inclusive leader. This is a topic I'm really passionate about. I've seen firsthand the difference this has made for me personally in my career and on both sides, both being led with inclusion as well as striving to be an inclusive leader. I'll give you tangible takeaways that you can action immediately after this session. I don't want you just to take my word for it, though. Let's take a look at why we should even care about this topic. Inclusive leadership isn't just the right thing to do. Jane, I'm just going to stop for just a moment. Sorry.
You're good.
We've got an echo of my voice showing up for me while I present.
Do you got headphones?
Very distracting.
Put some headphones on. Plug in headphones.
I apologize, everybody, for the delay and problem.
All right, now try it.
All right, let's give this a go.
That sounds better.
So what's the current state of the game industry right now? We've got 23% of game developers identifying as female. We've got 92% of decision makers that are white males. We've got 48% of studios polled who've implemented accessibility features. That's actually a nice story. And interestingly enough, this last number, 21% of developers have self-identified as LGBTQ+. This last point highlights the importance of inclusion in a different way, because according to a 2023 Gallup poll, about 7.6% of the entire US population identifies as LGBTQ+. So the higher proportion we're seeing in the games industry actually might be a good news story, that developers might feel more typically accepted by the gaming community as compared to other industries. I started my career in games in 2003 at the age of 39. I was a mother of three, entering this industry at a time when diversity was hardly a conversation, was both scary and exhilarating. In my first week, I found myself with 30 people discussing games we were going to build for the PlayStation Portable launch. And it was a huge eye-opener to realize I was the only woman in the room. Over the years, I found myself working really hard to fit in. I was part of a FIFA franchise, and it felt often like the old boys club, to be honest. After nearly 14 years of Electronic Arts, I worked my way to senior director level, but I was still often the only woman in senior leadership meetings. At a team level, female representation was typically closer to 10 or 15%. Another aspect of my experience at EA that shaped my thoughts around this conversation related to inclusion was working with global partners and taking international assignments. I spent time living in Argentina. I spent about 6 years living in Europe, including Romania, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. And I began to study and deeply understand what cultural inclusion is and how to navigate leadership in new ways. So the experience really shaped my passion for inclusive leadership, and that's what led me to co-found Simply Sweet Games with Karina Khan. We are passionate about this idea that we can create games where everybody feels like they belong. The Center for Creative Leadership defines inclusive leadership as a dedication to treating every member fairly, fostering an environment where they belong and are valued, and providing the resources and support where we can reach the highest potential. So in other words, we're committing to equitable treatment, a sense of fairness and belonging. And we have the tools and the resources we need to be successful. That's what inclusive leadership looks like. Back in 2016, Deloitte identified cultural intelligence as one of 6 signature traits of an inclusive leader. And we're going to look at that a little bit more deeply. But there are 6 traits listed on this in this chart, and let's talk about them. Cognizance is about awareness. Unconscious bias can impact how we hire, how we do promotions. It can affect the way we design our games. By recognizing where our biases exist, and we're more able to foster equitable processes. Being curious is when innovation will thrive because we're seeking diverse perspectives. We're looking across gender, generations, cultures. We're trying to enrich our narratives and the mechanics of our games and the effectiveness of our teams. I would argue that cultural intelligence is needed to achieve all of the other parts of this circle. We're going to go into that in a bit more detail as to what that is. Collaboration, the best games come, of course, from diverse teams working effectively together. Courage, it's hard to address inequities. It takes bravery, and it's challenging to face some of the barriers we see or the standards that we've seen in the games industry, like crunch culture. And then finally, commitment. Inclusivity isn't just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing something that we have to be doing all the time. So let's dig a little deeper into this concept of cultural intelligence. CQ, or cultural intelligence, is our ability to relate and work effectively with people who are different than ourselves. It's based on decades of research. It is scientifically rooted, and we know that it can be measured, and we also know we can improve it. You can take intentions to become a more effective leader and to become a more effective person in the way you navigate the world around you. It's giving you the skills and confidence to be an inclusive leader. Often the world of culture, the word of culture invokes things like nationality, ethnicity, where our grandparents were born, the language we speak. What I want to do is take a step back and think about, what is cultural diversity really? The concept is actually rooted in understanding what is accepted and familiar in a given situation. You behave differently at your grandmother's house than you do in church, than you do in the workplace, than you do at home. So we can think about cultural diversity in many different ways. For example, the generation that we're born in, our gender group, disabilities, invisible or invisible, neurodiversity, functionality. For example, the functional roles, artists and engineers have a different culture on teams. The country in which we were born or in which your parents were born, and the team in which you're in, or maybe the studio. All these ways are different elements of culture. And we might span many of these different elements of culture. And that's where a term called intersectionality comes in. Intersectionality isn't a theory, it's a lived reality for virtually all of us. It's the idea that our identities don't exist in isolation. So being a woman in the games industry is one thing. But being a mature woman in the games industry who's neurodiverse and potentially a woman of color, that's a whole different experience. And we're constantly asked to put labels on ourselves: race, gender, age, neurodiversity. But what happens when those labels don't align to how we personally see ourselves, or when they don't even tell the whole story, right? So instead of feeling seen, we might feel reduced or invisible. Intersectionality can affect things like who gets hired and promoted, and the stories that get told. And the thing is that the barriers that we face with these types of different identities might not just add up, they're actually multiplying in their effect. This is also about how we see ourselves in our games. It also relates to the games we're designing. Time we stop letting labels define people and maybe try to strive to find ways to hear their whole stories. And that brings me to the cultural intelligence framework. I mentioned that it's rooted in the research, and the research tells us there are four capabilities that are rooted in this science or this ability to work and relate effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. The first capability is referred to as CQ drive, and it represents our motivation. It's all about, are we interested? Are we able to persist? And are we confident we're going to be successful when we engage with people different than ourselves? So cultural intelligence has to start here because we need to be motivated to care in the first place. The next capability is all about awareness, cognizance, or what we call CQ knowledge. It's our ability to navigate and understand how cultures are similar and different. How does leadership show up differently? How do I want to be led? And might that look different than how you want to be led? I had a bunch of aha moments in this area when I was working with the teams in Argentina and another team in Russia. The type of leadership they needed looked very different than the team in Vancouver. So even though we were all working on the same project, I had to flex my leadership style to be most effective in the way I assigned work, delivered praise, constructive criticism, and all of these things. I had to learn how to be to adapt. And to do that, I use my CQ strategy. CQ strategy is referred to as metacognition. It's our ability to plan and be aware for the cross-cultural situation before we get into it and seeing it in the moment. For example, if I'm in a room, how do I make sure all voices are being heard? It's about checking the assumptions that might be getting made. So I might have had a mental map in my mind that you were going to behave a certain way because of the culture group or groups that you belong in. But then when I turned around and checked it out again, I thought, oh, I was wrong. I need to readjust my mental maps for the next time. And that leads me to the final capability, which is all about our behaviors. Can we adapt our verbal or our nonverbal behaviors in a way that allows us to be effective? As an example, speaking more quickly or more slowly, adding more pauses. How close should we stand when we talk? How direct of a communicator should I be? And so on. So all of these are ways that we're sort of pushing outside of our normal way of behaving to find a way to adapt our behaviors to be more effective, but without losing our own cultural identity in the process. So together, these four capabilities are what's needed to help you step into any cross-cultural situation and be more effective. So we've set the context now. What are you going to actually do about this information, right? I want to get practical here because I could easily spend the whole day talking about science and the impact. But my goal is to give you a few key areas you can focus on to truly become an inclusive leader. So we'll look at four different areas, and there are different pillars of inclusive leadership. These are the four I thought we could focus on for best impact today. The first one is about self-awareness and building a growth mindset, our ability to recognize biases and blind spots, our willingness to commit to continuous learning. Psychological safety is about creating an environment where team members feel valued and heard. It's about learning how to handle difficult conversations with care. When we think about equity in decision making, everything in business and in leadership all centers around decision making. We're making dozens and dozens of decisions all the time in business. So identifying where systemic barriers might be happening in our processes and our policies and helping, for example, ensure transparency in the way we're working to make decisions is what we're going to look at here. And finally, diverse perspectives. How can we leverage our cultural intelligence? How do we build inclusive collaboration to get input from underrepresented voices? How can we structure meetings, for example, to ensure all voices are heard? So let's start with that first pillar, self-awareness. Know thyself. When we talk about self-awareness, it's really not just at a surface level of referring to. we're really digging in deeper and thinking about why do we think the way we do and feel the way we do and act the way we do? Because our decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They're shaped by the experiences that are around us, what's going on in the moment, our culture and our environment, and in ways we might not even realize. So the challenge is exactly that. We might not even know that our brains are taking shortcuts to less desirable decisions. And that's sometimes referred to as bias or unconscious bias. And let's be real here. We all have bias. It's not a bad thing. Bias is inevitable. If we have a brain, we're biased. And we know those biases can practice both individually and organizationally. So we can't change the fact that bias exists. There's something we can do to manage the intentional choices and make intentional choices to manage the impact of bias on behaviors and decisions. So Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his work with Amos Tversky on how intuition works. And he wrote about it in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It addresses the way we make decisions both with our intuitive mind or system one thinking versus our system two mind, which is what is all about where our rational thinking takes place. So system one is fast, effortless, and automatic. It simply happens. I say 1 + 1, your brain thinks 2. System one is always coming naturally, and it's where unconscious bias originates in. But with positive intention, we push ourselves to system two. And the funny thing is, we all tend to think of ourselves as very rational human beings. We like to believe we're sitting in system two most of the time. But the reality is that Daniel Kahneman's research proved that the vast majority of the time, we default to system one thinking. But with cultural intelligence, we can help push ourselves into system two. We can take specific actions to reduce the influence of bias and help push us into system two. So again, it's this concept of activation versus application that I'm trying to drive to. We all have biases, but we don't have to act upon them. Here's some examples of some of the things that will affect us. When we are under pressure, under time pressure, we're more likely to use system one thinking, fall into the default, right? So even taking a small pause before you need to make a decision can have a significant impact on your ability to move yourself from system one to system two. The next really big area of influence is being tired, fatigue. So making sure we're managing both our physical state of being and our emotional state of being, managing that fatigue will help because when we're tired, we're much more likely to get rely on intuition and fall into an autopilot mode in everything we do, including the decisions we're making. And finally, distraction. Again, this is about what's going on in the moment. Do we have a lot of distractions happening? Are there a lot of activities going on? Have I got a lot of things on my mind? We're much more likely to make biased decisions when we're distracted. And if you're making a decision that involves a significant amount of uncertainty or ambiguity, it's even more important that you remove as many distractions as possible before you make your decision. Now let's talk about assumptions for a moment. What do you assume in your daily interactions with others? What biases show up? What's their possible impact? How does culture come into the equation? How much do you attribute some of these behaviors to a different personality or quirky personality versus culture? For example, if you see that your colleague nods in a meeting, what does that mean? Does that mean that they agreed with you? That they understood what you said? Both? Neither? If you're giving feedback to a subordinate as a team member, and throughout this critical presentation or feedback session, they don't ask any questions or offer any feedback, what are you supposed to infer? Does that assumption apply to every member of your team? Culturally intelligent, inclusive leadership says we're going to suspend judgment, reacting to our default assumptions. Because here's the thing. Respect is cultural. The way in which we perceive good manners and the way we which to demonstrate respect can change based on cultural expectations. If you ever hear somebody say, just be respectful, I encourage you to challenge that comment. What does that really mean to them? A simple example is this. Is slurping considered a rude behavior to you? For my husband, it absolutely is. He thinks it's the height of rudeness, and it bothers him enormously. But for some parts of the world, that's considered a compliment to the food preparer. Respect might also come into play in terms of who sits where in a meeting room, who speaks first. Is it appropriate to question your boss? How should we deal with conflict? What about showing up on time for a meeting? Is it more important for me to finish our conversation naturally and be a few minutes late for my next meeting? Or should I absolutely say, no, 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 I gotta cut this short. Respect is showing up in time for my meeting. So, the way to think about this concept is maybe to take us away from this old concept of the golden rule, and let's talk about the platinum rule. In most cultures, we have a golden rule or something similar to it. This idea that we want to treat others the way we ourselves want to be treated. Do unto others as we would have them do unto us. But there's a problem with this idea because it assumes we all want to be treated the same. And I don't believe that's true. The platinum rule provides a better way. It suggests we treat others how they want to be treated. This is a better way to demonstrate respect and empathy. So what I want to do now is share some of the framework we can use, something called cultural values, which can impact our perception of respectful and expected behaviors and the way we work and relate to others. This is about how we can see cultural bias. The fish might not be aware of its surroundings. It might not even be aware it's in water. But if we scoop it into that water and put it into a new larger bowl, its view of the world has changed dramatically. It will become aware of this new water, which also might feel very different to it. And culture is the same thing for us as humans. It can be really hard to know we're experiencing it culture until we're swimming in new waters. And we might not even be aware of how this lack of awareness is distorting our perception of the world around us and the people that we interact with. So, cultural values is this idea that we can talk about and describe a spectrum of how we prefer to work and relate to others. This is something that is very deep within us. It's driven by our core beliefs and assumptions. It's rooted in our childhood upbringing, the early experiences of our young adult life, and the influences of our community around us as we grew up. It's not something that changes typically a lot over a lifetime, but that doesn't mean we can't navigate effectively when we're different than others. It just means we want to be aware of where we might sit on that spectrum and how it could affect us when we're dealing with somebody who's in a different place on the spectrum. So let me give you an example. The first cultural value we're going to look at is called individualism versus collectivism. And again, this is a spectrum. You might see yourself much more on the side of individualism, somewhere on the side of collectivism, or somewhere anywhere in the middle. Individualism is a concept where we're thinking about the emphasis of individual goals, individual rights, and the immediate family unit. North America and US is very, very individualistic as a general rule in its cultural mindset. Collectivists, and you're going to hear things from individuals like, let me take care of this. I got it done. And you're going to want to give these people as much autonomy as possible in what they're doing. You want to allow them a chance to have their voices heard. Collectivists, on the other hand, are all about the relationship and the group relationship and what's best for everybody. So they might say things like, let me share with our team. We want to give this type of individual chances for consultation and chances to build community with the group. When I worked with the teams in Argentina and Russia, they were more collectivist. They wanted group goals. They thought about their efforts in a collectivist basis. So they didn't really like me calling out individual people on the team for praise. They wanted me to praise the whole team. But the team in North America, my team in Vancouver, they were very happy for me to give them a shout out and go, John, you're amazing. Andrea, well done on that last milestone. Love what you did. And they would be very proud and happy for them. The next cultural value I want to look at is very impactful to leadership because it's very much how we think about leadership. Do we prefer a more flat, egalitarian style of leadership where there's an emphasis on equality and shared decision making? Or do we believe that it's more appropriate to for the boss to be the boss? There should be a difference in status. My boss should make smart decisions for me, right? So in this case, where I saw this show up is that again, the team in Russia, they wanted me to be very clear, very specific, very directive about how they would get things done. Same with the team in Romania, same with the team in Argentina. But when I worked with the team in North America, they just wanted me to ask them smart questions. They didn't want me to give them smart answers. And the other thing I need to be very careful of here is I'm referencing countries that I've worked with and different cultural values in those areas the world. But the reality is there's a diversity of perspectives in every region and every country. And it's really, again, rooted in our life experiences. So if you saw my chart on a spectrum, I'm actually a little bit closer to higher power distance and low power distance based on my family upbringing. Even though I do identify as Canadian, North American, and everything else, and probably a lot of Canadians are more low power distance. The next cultural value I want to explore briefly is uncertainty avoidance, and this is one that can create a lot of conflict on diverse teams. It's the extent to which we can be flexible and adaptable. In other words, we're ready to make decisions, new decisions based on new information. It's also relevant to how planning is done. For high uncertainty avoidance, there's much more emphasis on planning and predictability. We want to make sure we've got a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. We want predictability. For somebody who's low uncertainty avoidance, they're more likely to say things like, I love a new challenge. We want to strive to invite them to explore different solutions. For people who are high uncertainty avoidance, we hear things like, are we sure this will work? They prefer a focus on traditions and having few plans to eliminate uncertainty. Be cautious of bias in the workplace when it comes to this particular cultural value preference. You might hear your low uncertainty avoidance team members say, they're always so rigid and inflexible. Why are they always so afraid to take a chance? And on the other side of the coin, the individuals who are high uncertainty avoidance might believe their low uncertainty avoidance colleagues are way too ready to take a risk. Context is another cultural value that can create a lot of conflict on diverse teams. It's the extent to which we prefer to communications that are very clear, specific, and correct. In other words, our words mean our words, versus more indirect and with an emphasis on harmony and saving face. We tend to see more of a low context communication style in North America. High context communication style is more prevalent in Asian contexts. And these are just stereotypes, so be careful. It can also affect things like how comfortable we are communicating with someone very different than us. So, as an example, I'm pretty low confident communicator. When I'm communicating with somebody high context, I might feel impatient with them. I might say, "Can you please be more specific?" But they might be paying really hard attention to my tone of voice, my body language. They're not paying as much attention to what I'm saying as how I'm saying it, and they might respond with, "Let me think about that," when asked a direct question. And time. This is not about punctuality, but about how we want to focus on getting things done. Do we prefer one thing at a time and success now? Or are we more, I'm okay to pay now for success later and more of a long-term focus? And we so often can see a difference in leadership where executive or studio leaders tend to be a little bit more on the long-term focus. They're thinking about the 1 to 3 to 5 year plan, and the team just wants to know, what do we need to do tomorrow? So navigating those differences are also very important to respect and understand. With somebody who is more short-term focused, try and find ways to make sure they see the wins in the moment. They know why something that's focused on the long term, how it benefits in the current term. And for somebody who's more long-term focused, help them understand how today's actions will help us invest and benefit the future. The last cultural value I want to cover with you, oh, sorry, I've got two more. Monochronic versus polychronic. This is about whether we prefer to get one thing done at a time versus multitasking. And there's an idea that we're comfortable with work and home life being overlapped, right? And so, for example, somebody who's polychronic might say, give me a call this weekend or this evening, that's fine. Somebody who's monochronic is much less likely to appreciate that. Um, I've seen this difference with my co-founder. I am more polychronic. I tend to be involved with a lot of different things going on my plate. My co-founder is more monochronic and linear focused. She prefers to get one thing done at a time and stay focused on that something. And so I have to be very conscious about interrupting her concentration and not reaching out to her just every time I have a question or want to talk about something. So we do use asynchronous means to reduce the impact of that. And then this one, expressiveness, is one that again really have challenges of bias showing up on diverse teams. That's a hard one for me because I'm a terrible poker player. Somebody who's more non-expressive is very good at hiding their feelings. They kind of have more non-emotional communication. You might see them and get somebody in a meeting like this and wonder why they didn't react to some very good or very bad news. Be aware of and your bias there. It could simply be that they're non-expressive in their cultural mindset. On the other hand, you might see credibility affected by somebody being more expressive or effective. You might say they're always so emotional. So really be careful again what your perceptions are. Somebody somebody who is more neutral might need to try and strive to add a bit of more emotion to their conversations. Somebody who's more expressive might need to try to strive to manage their emotional expressiveness and their body language in certain contexts. And an example of that for me was in Sweden. Most Swedes tend to lean a little bit more non-expressive. My very expressive, outgoing nature wasn't always well appreciated. So what I can say about cultural values is they help us provide a journal orientation to life, to work, to relationships. They help us understand when we might have biases towards others of different cultural values. They don't predict our ability to work with somebody different than ourselves. That's cultural intelligence. Cultural values just simply are a piece of knowledge, a potential stereotype that might help you be more effective when you're navigating somebody who has a different cultural mindset than yourself. Now, I want to talk about this question. Now we're going to try to tie a lot of this together into actions as well and ask what does it take to make teams successful? And what I learned was that Google spent 4 years and examined over 200 teams to explore this question. They undertook a project called Project Aristotle, and they learned this. They learned that psychological safety was the number one success factor for high performance teams. In other words, teams that felt safe to take risks and be vulnerable were the most successful. And that research confirmed what Dr. Amy Edmondson, who was a Harvard business professor, also discovered in her own research back in 1999. And Dr. Edmondson defined it as something that's going to influence how we share information, learn, innovate, and its presence allows the team members to feel like they can act authentically. So this sounds like a pretty desirable thing, right? We all want to foster psychological safety because we all want high performance teams. How exactly can we do that? Well, there are some really clear actions we can take. The first one is strive to be transparent. This builds trust. And an example about that might be share news as early as possible with your team that you have. Talk about how you're making decisions and admit when you've been wrong. And an example for Simply Sweet Games in this area relates to some of our challenges related to funding and making sure they know how long we can keep paying them for until we've got more funding in place. I need to know that you can trust me. I don't want to surprise them. We also need to set clear expectations. And for example, do we have something called KPIs or key performance indicators? Do we understand what good looks like and how to achieve outcomes? What are the desired outcomes? Being as clear and specific as possible and setting clear goals for your team is the best way to foster psychological safety. Seek to reframe mistakes as learning opportunities. Instead of saying things like, what happened, which has a blame culture to it, think about being curious. What did we learn? Communicate with care in everything that you do. Another example, are we missing anything? Hmm. Instead of that, try, what are we missing? Words have power. Don't ever forget that. Seek to find ways to have all voices heard. An example of how we can do that. If I'm in a virtual meeting and I've got people who tend not to contribute in their view, how might I get their voices heard? Well, I might put them in a small breakout group with one or two other team members to have a smaller conversation about the topic we're covering as a group. We then bring them back into the main room and allow them as a smaller group instead of as an individual to share their insights and thoughts. That creates a really safe way for them to contribute to the conversation. We can also use different things like Miro boards or other virtual tools to allow for creative brainstorming. And we don't necessarily have to include names. We can allow people to contribute anonymously to these discussions. The next topic I want to cover is about equity in decision making, because there are very specific, again, practical actions you can take to enhance inclusion related to decision making in how you hire, you think about professional development, and in the day to day things that you're doing in your studio. How can you avoid defaulting to your system on thinking, and how can we create bias or reduce bias, at least the impact of bias and the application of bias in these three areas. So for hiring, think about where and how you're recruiting. Are you posting in a variety of formats and communities to ensure that you're attracting as diverse a range of individuals as possible? Look at how you're assessing the skills and experience needed for the role. Make sure that you're being as explicit as possible, and make sure that the skills and the experience that you're asking for are essential for the role. Finally, make sure that you're using a very consistent interviewing and evaluation process for all candidates. And an example of this for Simply Sweet Games, we have both a set of questions that we ask every candidate that we're going to hire, and then afterwards we debrief and we go through a rubric where we do an assessment of the individual against a pre-established set of criteria, both soft skills and technical skills that were needed for the role. In this way, although we're not removing bias, we're reducing the impact of bias in our decision making. For professional development, what I'm talking about is things like promotions, opportunities to go to conferences or attend classes, and so on. And many of these studios won't have a lot of money to do this, but at the same time, there may be opportunities, for example, to attend a conference like BBC or other virtual events. Think about documenting your process for how you make decisions on who gets to attend and partake in those events. Think about your decision making for how you handle promotions or lateral opportunities within the organization. If you are offering opportunities for professional development, make sure they're equitable and that everyone can participate if appropriate. For example, if the training requires that they go out of the city, maybe some of your team members who have elder or child care won't be able to participate. In general, just make sure you're really clear about how professional development is going to be handled. Transparency in this will help you build equity in your decision making. On the day-to-day basis, proactively find ways to facilitate perspective taking across the team. and look for ways to create explicit processes around how we're getting things done. For example, some of you may have heard of something called a RACI chart, RACI. And in a chart, a racing chart, we're asking ourselves, related to a decision, who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. It might sound like a lot of work, but it's actually really valuable exercise to go through to drive clarity, even on a small thing, on how we're making decisions. And with respect to how we build diverse perspectives, there's a wonderful book that I can recommend called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. And this book is really valuable because she offers a lot of tangible examples of how culture shows up. But probably the best message that she gives in this book is the understanding and awareness that multicultural teams, in other words, diverse teams, need low context processes. They, in other words, need to be as explicit as possible about how the work is going to get done and how information is shared so that we can avoid the pitfalls that might hinder effective communication and collaboration when we think and relate differently to each other. It's critical that we do this. Let me give you some examples. Agendas being sent before meetings mean that we can all check for understanding and ensure we know what's going to be covered, who should be at the meeting. And if I'm a little bit shy or uncomfortable asking questions in a moment, I have an opportunity to check and ask them at a time. Having meeting minutes shared means we all walk away with the same understanding of what we achieved and what we're going to be doing next. Team action boards and regular check-ins ensure that we're aligned on dependencies and what we need from each other to succeed. We're clear on what's next. Again, going back to that decision making, do we have a RACI chart? Some kind of means of understanding the types of decisions we're making, when they're being made, how they're being made, and why. Reporting processes, especially for remote and distributed teams, but even if you're working in person, making sure that we've got a standard way of talking about progress. What does a good report look like? Well, who should I be sending it to? What's going to be in it? What measurements are we including? Do we have any key performance indices that we're tracking? And in general, be clear about what good looks like. Define the target goal all the time for everyone. So it's almost time to have some Q&A. But what I wanted to do was first kind of look at what are 4 different things you can do in summary to increase inclusion and become a more inclusive leader. The first quadrant goes back to CQ drive. Remember, this is motivation, our willingness to engage with those different others. And here's the thing, the most common conflict on diverse teams is clashing expectations. I had a different idea of what we needed to do than you did. And the more diverse your team, the more likely you are going to have different expectations. So you really want to keep everybody motivated by aligning them on goals and aligning them on expectations of what's being done and how it's being done. The next quadrant is about our CQ knowledge, right? Our awareness. So seek to facilitate really rich conversations about cultural differences. Talk about the holidays you're celebrating in your respective homes. Share some insights that you've learned from a session like today and talk about how it's showing up day to day. As we talk about these things, we're really building everyone's awareness and cultural knowledge. So share stories. Next is using explicit processes. So this is really leveraging our CQ strategy or our metacognition. So we're motivated and we're aware. How do we translate that into action? So this is again about our decision making, our communication style. The clear goal here is reduce assumptions and opportunities for misunderstandings to occur. And most importantly, celebrate diversity. Look for ways to draw upon the diversity of your team. Go beyond tolerating cultural value differences and use them strategically as an catalyst for engagement. The reality is, whether you've encountered it or not, you likely have a diverse team, even if that diversity doesn't exist in the way that you expect it. Celebrate that. See how it can benefit you. I realize that some of you may have added questions into the chat along the way. I have a question for you all, though, and I would welcome you putting a note in the chat to share this with me. I would welcome you connecting with me on LinkedIn if you'd like to share it with me. But I'd really like to know, and I will be happy to share the message broader to a larger audience. What actions will you take? How can we inspire action from leaders in the games industry to prioritize inclusion? How can we elevate our games, strengthen our teams, and create a more welcoming environment where everyone feels like they belong? What will you do different? I hope we can grow stronger together. So now, go ahead and open it up to Q&A. But I did want to point out that on this slide, you have a QR code to take you to my studio's website. So this is a shameless plug for my studio, Simply Sweet Games. You go check out our game, follow us on social media, and reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you, Tina. And her game is really fun. I played it. I enjoyed it. All right. So we've got a few minutes here. So we've got some questions, some from YouTube and some came in from Discord. So from YouTube, how do you navigate an environment that prefers indirect communication when you struggle with things such as social cues, tone, and other similar non-spoken versions of communication? Are you there?
That's a really excellent question. I like that a lot. So, and it's pretty common, right? We have a studio or a team that are all very direct communicators, and I'm an indirect communicator. I don't tend to behave that way. The first thing you have to do is maybe talk about it and help share an awareness that not as comfortable with that style of communication. That awareness will help all of us navigate the difference effectively. There's also some obligation on our part to try to adapt, though, right? That's our seeking action. So what I would suggest is if you're an indirect communicator as a leader, for example, and you find it quite hard to give direct feedback to a team member who you know will benefit from it, practice. That's all. Just practice. You have to get over comfort zone and try these things. So I might try giving you, use Jay as an example. I might ask Jay, do that practice on you. I've got to give some feedback to someone to direct practice. And I should do it verbally and in writing. The more we do it, the more likely we can adapt and go ahead and try to be a little bit different than what's our default style. So that helps answer that question.
All right. So from early on in the talk, from Discord. So what are some of the effective ways to eliminate or manage crunch?
It's a really great question. This is more of a project management question than an inclusive leader question, but I guess on an inclusive leader, would be creating a culture where people are able to tell you things are going sideways, right? They're comfortable to share bad news early so that you can adapt and adjust the plan. If I have not created a psychologically safe place in my team, as an example, my art leader, my engineering might not tell me that we're not going to reach the goals of the next milestone until we get there. And at that point, if I made a strong commitment to get a product launch or a demo, there might be no other action available to us as a team not to crunch. So I need to, as a leader, create enough mechanisms where I can measure the amount of work that's available and ways to check in. And it's just, and as a leader, I just don't celebrate crunch. I never have. I don't know. It's almost hard for me to answer this question because there was one project in electrical crunch. they basically asked me to go to every team member and say, would you like to work Saturday or Sunday this weekend? If it was a long weekend, they had to work, they only got 1 day off of the 2 days. It was awful. And I swore to myself I would never put myself in that situation again. I never did it after that again. But it does require rigorous project management principle practices to avoid. I hope that answers that question.
All right. So another one from Discord. Given this global yet tight-knit industry, where can we go to learn the basics of some of the other cultures that we encounter?
I love that question as well. What I would propose to do is I can share some research with you through LinkedIn. If you watch the post, I'll share some follow-ups on this question. You can also go to my own website, teammary.ca, and you'll find some blog posts on this topic and resources. You're effectively wanting to look at cultural intelligence and cultural values. There's also an individual by the name of Gert Hofstede, and I can also share a link to his work. That's where I did my first field of study related to global cultures and how they show up for us. And be careful as you do this study of cultures and culture groups to monitor the stereotypes that you're going to encounter and use your CQ strategy to check the assumptions before you apply any action against them.
All right. We're going to end on a very strong one here. From Twitch, do you have suggestions on how to bring this idea of inclusive excellence forward in the challenging US, but I mean also other countries, environment where certain groups are actively working against this focus?
Yeah, that's a really tough. I have a lot of empathy for what we're all going through in North America right now. My best advice is to evoke a sense of curiosity, right? We're going to encounter people who think very, very differently than ourselves in our lives, and a lot of polarization going on in the world. I really encourage you to foster a sense of curiosity in yourself and try to inspire it in others. Um, Rarely are we wrong in any equation, no matter how strongly we feel about it. There's usually somewhere in, and so I think our obligation in this conversation of excellence is really strive to find that middle ground of, where do we have common interests? Where do we have common beliefs? Why do you feel the way you do? Just be genuinely curious. Genuinely curious. Be careful that you're not being pedantic about it. But if you can demonstrate, how do you feel about it? Help me understand that. That can go a long way to bridging some of the gaps we see in this polarization, in my opinion. Thank you for that question.
I'll give you my shorter, more blunt, from here in the States, you just do the best you can without government interaction and you ignore the haters and move along. And that's all you can do for yourself and your company without just driving yourself crazy. All right. Tina, thank you so much. This is fantastic. We always love having you on. We're going to wrap up this one. Tina's on our Discord server as well. So if you're not on our Discord server, it's just discord.gg/indie game business. We're there with around 9,000 other folks from the industry. So feel free to drop a chat there. But we're going to step away, and Dan and Ash are going to come right back with our next speaker today. Thanks, everybody.